Welcome to another exploration into the darker corners of American history, stories that remain as mysterious as they are unsettling. Before we begin, take a moment to let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time of day or night this narration has reached you. In the year 1800, along the muddy trading routes that carved through the endless Illinois prairie, there existed a place where hospitality meant something darker than anyone could have imagined. The frontier was a place of promise and peril, where the line between civilization and wilderness blurred into something uncertain, something dangerous. And somewhere along that uncertain border stood a farmhouse that would become the subject of whispered warnings for generations to come. The discovery came on a cold October morning, when a trapper stumbled upon a leather-bound journal half buried in the tall grass near what locals called the Devil's Stretch, a particularly desolate section of the trade route between settlements. The pages were water-stained and crumbling, but the final entries were still legible, written in an increasingly unsteady hand. The traveler, whose name appeared to be Jonathan Mercer, described his journey westward with the measured optimism typical of the era. He wrote of the beauty of the open land, the promise of new opportunities, and the kindness of strangers who offered shelter along the way. But it was his last entry that sent a chill through anyone who read it. Mercer wrote of approaching nightfall and spotting a warm glow in the distance, a farmhouse offering refuge from the gathering darkness. He described a family who welcomed him with open arms, who set a place at their table and spoke of the hardships of frontier life with the easy familiarity of those who had survived it. The wife, he noted, had kind eyes and a gentle manner. The husband was quiet but strong, a man shaped by hard work and harder winters. Their son rarely spoke, but watched everything with an intensity that Mercer found slightly unsettling, though he dismissed it as the awkwardness of youth isolated from society. "They have offered me shelter for as long as I need," Mercer wrote. "The barn is clean, the food plentiful, and the company surprisingly pleasant for such a remote location. I count myself fortunate to have found such generous souls in this wilderness. Tomorrow I shall continue my journey, but tonight I rest easy knowing there are still good people in this wild country." The entry was dated September 14th, 1800. Jonathan Mercer was never seen again. Neither was his horse, his belongings, or any trace of the path he might have taken after that night. He simply vanished, as though the prairie had opened up and swallowed him whole. And he was far from the only one. The locals had a name for that farmhouse, though few spoke it above a whisper. They called it Harper's Rest, though the family who lived there wasn't named Harper. No one could quite remember where that name came from, perhaps from a traveler long ago, or perhaps from something older, something that predated even the first European settlers who had claimed this land as their own. What they did know was that Harper's Rest had a reputation, and it was not the reputation of kindness that its inhabitants cultivated so carefully. Guests arrived at Harper's Rest. That much was certain. The farmhouse sat at a crucial juncture along the trade route, positioned perfectly to catch travelers as daylight faded and the prairie's dangers grew more immediate. In an era when a night spent in the open could mean death from exposure, wild animals or worse, the sight of a lit window promising warmth and safety was irresistible. Travelers from as far east as Ohio and as far west as the Mississippi territories had been known to stop there. Merchants hauling goods to St. Louis, trappers returning from the northern woods, families seeking new lives in the expanding territories, all manner of people passed through that stretch of Illinois, and many of them would have seen that farmhouse as a blessing. But those who checked in to Harper's Rest, it seemed, never quite managed to check out, at least not all of them. And that distinction between those who left and those who didn't would become the source of a mystery that haunted the region for decades. A puzzle with pieces scattered across years and miles, each one stained with blood and buried secrets. The frontier in 1800 was a place of transformation, where the young American nation was pushing westward with a mixture of ambition and desperation. Illinois was still a territory then, a vast expanse of prairie and forest that existed in a strange liminal space between Native American sovereignty and American settlement. The indigenous peoples who had lived on this land for generations were being displaced, their traditional roots and territories carved up by treaties they had little say in. Into this complicated landscape poured waves of settlers, each bringing their own hopes, fears, and sometimes their own darkness. Life on the frontier was brutal in ways that modern minds struggle to comprehend. A simple injury could become fatal without proper medical care. Winters were harsh enough to kill entire families who had misjudged their provisions. The isolation was profound. Settlements could be separated by dozens of miles of empty prairie, and communication between them was sporadic at best. In this environment, communities developed unwritten rules about hospitality and mutual aid. To turn away a traveler in need was considered not just inhospitable but potentially murderous, condemning them to a night exposed to elements and predators. It was into this world that the Hollis family arrived sometime in the mid-1790s, though records from that period are frustratingly sparse. Thomas Hollis appeared in land records as the owner of a substantial plot along what would become a major trade route, though how he acquired the land and where he came from remained unclear. Those who remembered the family's early years, and by the time investigators began asking questions, those memories were already fading, described Thomas as a man of medium height and build, unremarkable in appearance, but possessing a quiet intensity that some found unsettling and others mistook for the stoicism required of frontier life. His wife Eleanor was remembered differently. Multiple accounts describe her as a woman of surprising refinement for such a remote location, someone who seemed to carry the manners and speech patterns of a more civilized place. She kept a clean home, maintained a small garden even in the harsh prairie soil, and treated guests with a warmth that seemed genuine. Some speculated she came from a good family back east, perhaps Philadelphia or Boston, and had married beneath her station. Others whispered that she was running from something, though what that might be remained a matter of speculation. Then there was Caleb, their son. If Thomas was quiet and Eleanor was warm, Caleb existed somewhere else entirely, a presence that many found difficult to describe. Those who had seen him remembered a young man, probably in his early 20s by the late 1790s, who moved with an odd grace and spoke rarely. When he did speak, his words were precise and carefully chosen, as though he weighed each one before releasing it into the world. Some travelers who had stayed at the Hollis farm and lived to continue their journey mentioned Caleb in their letters and diaries, always with a note of discomfort. There was something about the way he watched people, they said, something about how he seemed to be studying guests rather than simply interacting with them. The Hollis family kept to themselves, which was not unusual for the time. Frontier homesteads were often isolated, with families seeing their neighbors only occasionally, and venturing to larger settlements perhaps a few times a year. But even by the standards of the era, the Hollises were notably reclusive. They rarely attended the sparse community gatherings that did occur, barn raisings, harvest festivals, or the occasional religious service held by traveling preachers. When they did appear, they were polite but distant, participating without truly engaging. This isolation might have been unremarkable if not for one thing. The Hollis' farm somehow prospered in ways that seemed to defy explanation. Their livestock was healthy and numerous. Their buildings, while not grand, were well maintained and showed signs of regular improvement. They seemed to have money for supplies when other families were barely surviving. In an era when most frontier families lived one bad harvest away from starvation, the Hollises appeared comfortable, even prosperous, and they had achieved this, apparently, through the simple act of taking in travelers and offering them shelter. But prosperity came at a cost that no one yet understood, and the price was being paid in blood and bones beneath the Illinois soil. The first disappearances were easy to dismiss. The frontier was a dangerous place after all, and people vanished with disturbing regularity. Disease, accidents, animal attacks, conflicts with Native American tribes defending their land, banditry. There were countless explanations for why a traveler might set out on a journey and never arrive at their destination. In a world where communication was slow and unreliable, it could take months or even years to confirm that someone had truly gone missing, rather than simply choosing a new direction or settling in some remote location. But by 1798, a pattern was beginning to emerge for those paying attention. Merchants traveling the route to St. Louis reported encountering fellow traders who spoke of stopping at a hospitable farm along the Devil's Stretch. These same merchants, when they reached St. Louis and compared notes with others in their trade network, found that several of their colleagues had simply failed to arrive. Trappers returning from the northern forests told stories of men they had met heading south, who then seemed to have vanished into the prairie. Families who had sent letters ahead to relatives in the Western Territories received no response, and when inquiries were made, it became clear that their loved ones had never reached their destinations. What made the pattern particularly troubling was how specific it was. The disappearances clustered around a particular stretch of the trade route, specifically the section that passed by the Hollis farm. Those who vanished had almost all been traveling alone or in very small groups. They tended to be people of modest means, but enough resources to make the journey worthwhile. Enough to have some money or goods, but not so much that their absence would trigger immediate and extensive searches. And almost all of them had been described by other travelers as heading toward or having recently left a friendly farm along the route. It was a local farmer named Samuel Pritchard who first brought his concerns to Sheriff James Dalton. In the late summer of 1798, Pritchard lived several miles from the Hollis property, close enough to be aware of their presence, but far enough that they weren't neighbors in any meaningful sense. He came to Dalton with a ledger in which he had been keeping notes, trying to track the disappearances that seemed to be multiplying around him. "It's not natural. James," Pritchard said, spreading his notes across Dalton's desk. "I've been keeping count. In the last 3 years, at least 15 people that we know of have vanished along that stretch of road. 15 that we can document. Letters that went unanswered, traders who never arrived, travelers who were seen by one person and never seen again. How many more might there be that no one noticed? Men with no families, drifters, people running from something who wouldn't be missed?" Sheriff Dalton was a practical man, someone who had survived the frontier by being careful and methodical rather than bold and rash. He looked over Pritchard's notes with the skepticism of someone who knew how easy it was to see patterns where none existed. "The frontier is dangerous, Samuel. You know that as well as I do. People die. People get lost. People decide to change their plans and head in a different direction." "I know that," Pritchard insisted. "But look at the pattern. Look at where they all disappeared. There's one common point. James, one place they all passed through or were heading toward." "The Hollis farm," Dalton said quietly. "The Hollis farm," Pritchard confirmed. Dalton had known the Hollises for years, at least in the distant way that frontier neighbors knew each other. He had never seen anything overtly suspicious in their behavior, but he had to admit there was something about the family that had always struck him as odd. He remembered Thomas Hollis's cold eyes, Eleanor's practiced warmth that sometimes seemed more performance than genuine emotion, and young Caleb's unsettling habit of watching without participating. He remembered, too, the rumors that had circulated over the years. Nothing concrete, just whispers and uncomfortable feelings that people tried to dismiss. "What are you suggesting I do, Samuel?" Dalton asked. "I can't arrest people based on the fact that travelers disappeared somewhere near their property. I'd need evidence. I'd need proof of something beyond coincidence." "Then find it," Pritchard said. "Because I'm not the only one thinking this. Others are starting to talk. There's a story making the rounds about the well on the Hollis property. They say it runs deeper than any well should, deeper than you'd need to go to reach water. They say if you stand near it on a quiet night, you can hear things down there, sounds that aren't just water and rocks." Dalton didn't put much stock in supernatural tales, but he was wise enough to know that such stories often contained a kernel of truth, a real observation that had been exaggerated through retelling. If people were talking about the Hollis, well, perhaps there was something worth investigating. But investigating required cause, and in the frontier justice system of 1798, vague suspicions weren't enough. "I'll make inquiries," Dalton promised. "Quiet ones. I'll ask around, see if anyone has seen anything concrete. But Samuel, you need to understand. Unless someone comes forward with real evidence, there's not much I can do. The law requires more than suspicion." Pritchard nodded, understanding but not satisfied. As he left the sheriff's office, he couldn't shake the feeling that something evil had taken root in the prairie, something that was feeding and growing while they all tried to rationalize it away. He thought about his own farm, about his wife and children sleeping peacefully, while something monstrous might be happening just a few miles away. The thought kept him awake that night and many nights after. Sheriff Dalton did make inquiries, though his investigation was hampered by the realities of frontier law enforcement. He had no deputies, no budget for extensive travel, and no real authority beyond what people chose to grant him. He spoke to travelers at the few inns and trading posts in the area, asking carefully worded questions about their experiences along the Devil's Stretch. He interviewed other farmers, trying to build a picture of the Hollis family and their activities. What he found was unsettling precisely because it was so ambiguous. Yes, many travelers had stopped at the Hollis farm. Yes, the family had a reputation for hospitality. And yes, it was true that people seemed to vanish along that particular stretch of road. But he could find no direct connection, no witness who had seen anything criminal, no physical evidence that pointed to foul play. The Hollises, when he questioned them casually about travelers they had hosted, were forthcoming and seemingly helpful. Eleanor showed him their guest ledger, a book in which she claimed to record the names of those who stayed with them, along with the dates of their visits. The ledger seemed innocent enough, though Dalton noticed that the entries were remarkably neat and uniform, as though they had been copied from some other source rather than written in the moment. "We do our Christian duty," Eleanor told him with that practiced warmth. "The frontier is harsh, and we all must help one another survive it. We offer shelter to those in need, a warm meal and a safe place to rest. If some of those travelers met with misfortune after leaving our home, that is tragic, but hardly our fault. We cannot control what happens to people once they leave our property." It was a perfectly reasonable response, and Dalton had no grounds to challenge it. He left the Hollis farm with more questions than answers, troubled by something he couldn't quite articulate. There was nothing overtly wrong with anything he had seen or heard, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something crucial, something hidden just beneath the surface of the Hollises' carefully maintained facade. But without evidence, he could do nothing except add his own observations to the growing collection of suspicions that surrounded the family. He made note of the well that Pritchard had mentioned, a stone structure near the barn that did indeed seem unusually deep. He noted, too, the cellar beneath the main house, its entrance half hidden by the kitchen structure, and secured with an iron lock that seemed excessive for a simple storage space. And he noted the way Caleb Hollis watched him throughout his visit, those strange eyes tracking his every movement with an intensity that felt like more than simple curiosity. Dalton documented his observations in his own records and warned other travelers to be cautious in that area, but he could go no further. In the absence of concrete evidence, the Hollis family continued their lives, continued welcoming travelers, and continued to prosper in ways that seemed increasingly difficult to explain. The winter of 1798 into 1799 was particularly brutal, with storms that turned the prairie into a frozen wasteland, and temperatures that drove even the hardiest settlers to huddle close to their fires and pray for spring. During those long, dark months, travel slowed to a trickle, and the Hollises were largely isolated even from their distant neighbors. But when the thaw came and the trade routes opened again, the disappearances resumed. It was during this period that the rumors began to take on a more specific shape. Farmhands working in fields near the Hollis property reported hearing strange sounds at night, not the normal sounds of frontier life, but something else. Something that sounded almost like screaming, though it was distant enough and distorted enough that it could have been wind or animals or any number of natural phenomena. One young man, a field worker named Thomas Brennan, swore that he had seen lights moving beneath the Hollis barn late one night, as though there was a space underneath the visible structure where lamps were being carried back and forth. These stories spread through the community like wildfire, growing more dramatic with each retelling. Some claimed that the Hollis well was actually a shaft that led to underground chambers where the family kept their victims. Others suggested that Thomas Hollis had been a criminal back east, perhaps a murderer or worse, who had fled to the frontier to continue his dark work away from law enforcement. A few even whispered that the family wasn't quite human, that they were something older and darker, that had taken human form to prey on the unwary. Sheriff Dalton tried to separate fact from fiction, but the line between them was becoming increasingly blurred. He knew that frontier communities were prone to panic and exaggeration, especially when isolated and afraid, but he also knew that rumors often contained kernels of truth, and the consistency of these stories, the underground spaces, the night, sounds the too deep well, suggested that people were observing something real, even if they were interpreting it through a lens of fear and superstition. The situation came to a head in the spring of 1799, when a traveling merchant named Robert Carson disappeared under circumstances that were impossible to dismiss. Carson was well known in the region, a reliable trader who had been making the circuit between settlements for over a decade. He had a wife and 3 children waiting for him in Ohio, and he was meticulous about maintaining contact with them through letters sent from various trading posts along his route. When he failed to arrive at his expected destination and his letters stopped coming, his wife raised an alarm that reached far beyond the local community. Carson's last confirmed sighting was at a trading post 3 days' journey from the Hollis farm. Multiple witnesses reported that he had spoken of making good time and planning to stop at that friendly farm along Devil's Stretch before continuing to St. Louis. He had been seen heading in that direction with a loaded wagon and 2 horses. Then nothing. He simply vanished, along with his wagon, his horses, and all of his merchandise. The disappearance of someone as well-known and well-connected, as Carson finally gave Sheriff Dalton the justification he needed to conduct a more thorough investigation. With several other men from the community, he rode out to the Hollis farm on a warm May morning, intending to search the property and question the family more intensively. But when they arrived, something was immediately wrong. The farmhouse looked abandoned. The door stood open, swinging slightly in the morning breeze. The barn doors were also open, and the livestock that should have been there were gone. As Dalton and his men approached cautiously, they saw that the property had been left in a state of eerie suspension. The table inside was set for dinner, plates and cups arranged neatly as though the family had been about to sit down for a meal and had simply vanished mid-preparation. Food in the kitchen had begun to spoil. Beds were unmade. Personal belongings were scattered about as though their owners intended to return at any moment, but the Hollis family was nowhere to be found. Thomas, Eleanor, and Caleb had disappeared as completely as any of their alleged victims. It was as though the prairie had opened up and swallowed them just as it had swallowed so many others. Dalton and his men searched the property thoroughly, looking for any clue to where the family might have gone or what might have happened to them. What they found instead was evidence of something far darker than they had imagined. In the cellar beneath the house, behind racks of preserved food and stacked supplies, they found a second door. This one was hidden behind a false wall that had been constructed to look like the natural stone of the cellar's foundation. The lock on this inner door was substantial, built to keep something in or someone out, and it took considerable effort to break it open. When they finally managed to force the door, the smell that wafted out nearly drove them back, a combination of rot, decay, and something chemical that burned their throats and stung their eyes. Beyond the door was a narrow passageway that descended steeply into the earth, its walls lined with rough-hewn timber to prevent collapse. Dalton, steeling himself against the stench and his own growing dread, led the way down with a lantern held high. The passage was longer than seemed possible, descending far deeper than any normal cellar would require. As they went deeper, they began to notice stains on the walls, dark patches that could have been water damage, but that their instincts told them were something far worse. The passage eventually opened into a crude underground chamber, a space roughly 20 feet across that had been carved out of the earth and reinforced with timber supports. The floor was hard-packed dirt that showed signs of having been dug up and replaced multiple times. Around the perimeter of the chamber, they found items that confirmed their worst fears. Piles of personal belongings that clearly had come from multiple different people. Clothing, bags, tools, weapons, jewelry, coins and documents, all sorted into rough piles as though someone had been organizing them for storage or later disposal. But it was what they found buried in the floor that provided undeniable proof of what had been happening at the Hollis farm. Using shovels they had brought from the barn above, Dalton and his men began excavating the areas where the earth seemed to have been most recently disturbed. Within an hour, they had uncovered the first body, or more accurately, what remained of it. The corpse was badly decomposed, barely more than bones and scraps of clothing, but it was undeniably human. They found a second body in a similar state, then a third. As they continued to dig, the magnitude of the horror became clear. The chamber was a mass grave containing the remains of at least a dozen people, perhaps more. Some of the bodies were relatively recent, still recognizable as human forms. Others had been there for years, reduced to scattered bones by decay and whatever creatures had found their way into this underground charnel house. The men worked in shocked silence, carefully removing each set of remains and laying them out in the barn above. As a farmer who had seen death in many forms, Dalton tried to maintain his composure, but even he was shaken by what they were uncovering. These weren't the bodies of people who had died in fights or accidents. The position of the remains, the way they had been dumped unceremoniously into shallow pits, spoke to something methodical and cold. These people had been murdered, stripped of their belongings and buried without ceremony or care. They had been reduced to nothing more than problems to be disposed of, obstacles that had been eliminated and hidden away. Among the personal effects, they found items that helped identify some of the victims. Robert Carson's leather document case was there, still containing some of his trading receipts and a letter he had been writing to his wife. A distinctive brass compass that had belonged to a trapper named Daniel Whitmore, reported missing in 1797, turned up in one of the piles. A woman's locket, a man's pocket watch, a distinctive knife with a carved handle. Each item was a breadcrumb leading back to someone who had trusted the wrong people, who had accepted hospitality that had proven fatal. But perhaps the most chilling discovery was the ledger they found hidden in a metal box buried in the corner of the chamber. This was not the neat guest register that Eleanor Hollis had shown Sheriff Dalton. This was the real record, a brutally honest accounting of the Hollis family's crimes. It contained names, dates, and brief descriptions of dozens of people who had stayed at the farm. Next to many of the names were additional notes, descriptions of what the victim had been carrying, estimated value of their possessions, and, in some cases, brief comments about how the murder had been carried out. The handwriting was precise and controlled, suggesting someone who viewed this not as a series of violent crimes, but as a business ledger, a record of transactions and inventory. Mercer Jonathan, September 14, 1800, traveling alone. Approximately $45 in coin, good horse, quality saddle and tack, disposed in Chamber 3, horse sold in St. Louis via intermediary. The clinical nature of the entries was somehow more disturbing than any expression of emotion or cruelty would have been. This was murder as business, death as commerce. As Dalton read through the ledger by lamplight in the barn, with the recovered bodies laid out around him and his men standing by in grim silence, he tried to comprehend the scale of what they had discovered. The ledger contained over 40 names spanning more than 6 years, 40 people who had been murdered for their possessions, their bodies hidden beneath the earth, while the Hollis family went on living their lives above, welcoming new victims with warm smiles and kind words. The estimated value noted next to each name suggested that the Hollises had accumulated substantial wealth from their crimes, thousands of dollars in money and goods, an enormous sum for the era, especially for a frontier family. But the most pressing question now was where the Hollis family had gone. The ledger's last entry was dated 3 days before Dalton's arrival, suggesting that the family had fled recently. Had they somehow learned that suspicion was mounting? Had they decided it was time to move on before they were caught? Or had something else prompted their sudden departure? Dalton ordered a search of the property expanded to include the surrounding areas. They found tracks leading away from the farm, heading west toward less settled territories, but the trail was already fading and would be impossible to follow across the open prairie. It was as though the family had simply dissolved into the landscape, becoming part of the wilderness they had used as cover for their crimes. Word of the discovery spread quickly, and within days, the Hollis farm had become the center of intense attention from law enforcement, journalists, and the morbidly curious. A more thorough excavation of the underground chamber revealed additional remains, bringing the total number of confirmed victims to 19. Though investigators believed there could be more that had been disposed of in other ways, or whose remains had deteriorated beyond recognition. The Illinois territorial government, still relatively new and struggling to establish order in the frontier, offered a substantial reward for information leading to the capture of the Hollis family. But despite extensive searches and numerous reported sightings, The Hollises were never found. In the months and years that followed, there were countless rumors about what had happened to them. Some claimed to have seen Eleanor in a settlement near the Mississippi, though the woman in question denied being her and had documentation suggesting she was someone else entirely. Others reported seeing a man matching Thomas Hollis's description working as a laborer on a riverboat, but by the time authorities investigated, the man had moved on. There were even stories that young Caleb had drowned himself in a river, overcome by guilt for his family's crimes, though no body was ever recovered to confirm this. The most persistent rumor was that the family had made it to the Louisiana Territory, still largely unexplored and outside effective American jurisdiction, where they had either started a new life under assumed names or met their end at the hands of Native Americans, disease, or the countless other dangers that lurked in the uncharted West. Some speculated that they had split up, each going their separate way to make pursuit more difficult. Others believed they had headed south to New Orleans, where they could have boarded a ship and disappeared to some foreign port. The truth was that in an era before photography, widespread literacy, or effective communication networks, it was entirely possible for people to simply vanish and remake themselves somewhere else. The frontier was full of people running from something, people who had left their past behind and adopted new identities. The Hollises had money thanks to their crimes, and they had demonstrated both intelligence and ruthlessness. If they wanted to disappear, they likely could, at least temporarily. But there was another theory, one whispered more quietly, but believed by more people than would admit it publicly. This theory held that the Hollis family had never left at all, that they were still there in some sense, buried somewhere on that cursed property or dissolved into the prairie itself. Some claimed to have seen lights moving around the ruins of the farmhouse at night, as though someone was still living there in secret. Others spoke of hearing voices on the wind or feeling watched when they passed by the property. A few brave or foolish souls who investigated the site after dark reported sensations of overwhelming dread, of feeling hands grabbing at them from the shadows, of hearing screams coming from beneath the earth. These supernatural claims were easy to dismiss as the products of overactive imaginations influenced by the horror of what had been discovered, but they persisted nonetheless. The prairie, it seemed, had its own memory, and the evil that had been done there had left a stain that couldn't simply be washed away by rain or covered over by grass. In the immediate aftermath of the discovery, there were those who wanted to see the Hollis property burned to the ground, the underground chamber filled in, and the earth salted so nothing would ever grow there again. But cooler heads prevailed, arguing that the site might still yield clues to the family's whereabouts or the identities of additional victims. The farmhouse was left standing but abandoned, and the property was seized by the territorial government with the understanding that it would eventually be auctioned off once the legal complexities were resolved. That auction never happened. Despite the property's strategic location and the value of the buildings and cleared land, no one wanted to buy it. The connection to the murders had tainted it in a way that no amount of time or distance seemed able to cleanse. Settlers who might otherwise have been interested couldn't shake the feeling that accepting such a bargain would be accepting blood money, profiting from evil. And beyond the moral considerations, there was the simple fact that living there would mean existing with the constant knowledge of what had happened beneath your feet, of the lives that had been stolen in those underground chambers. As years passed and the property remained unsold and unused, the buildings began to deteriorate. The farmhouse, once so well maintained, succumbed to weather and neglect. The roof collapsed during a storm in 1805. The barn burned under mysterious circumstances in 1808. Some said it was lightning. Others suggested it was arson by someone who wanted to erase the remaining evidence of the Hollis crimes. By 1815, when Illinois achieved statehood, little remained of the physical structures that had housed such horror. Nature was reclaiming the site, covering the scars with new growth. But even as the buildings crumbled, the stories grew stronger. The case of the Hollis farm had captured public imagination in a way that few frontier crimes did, perhaps because it represented a betrayal of the fundamental social contract that made survival possible in such a harsh environment. Hospitality was sacred on the frontier. It literally meant the difference between life and death for travelers. The idea that someone would exploit that sacred trust would use the offer of shelter as a lure to commit murder, struck at something fundamental in the frontier psyche. It suggested that the real danger wasn't just the obvious threats of wilderness and hardship, but the hidden evil that could lurk behind a friendly smile. The story became a cautionary tale, told to warn travelers and reinforce social bonds. Parents used it to teach their children about the dangers of trusting strangers too easily. Communities invoked it as they developed more formal systems of law enforcement and social oversight, using the Hollises as an example of what happened when people were too isolated and too unsupervised. The case became part of the region's mythology, a touchstone for discussions about morality, justice, and the thin line between civilization and savagery. Yet despite all the attention and all the investigations, one crucial question remained unanswered. Why had the Hollis family done it? The financial motive was clear enough. They had stolen substantial wealth from their victims. But was it purely about money? Or was there something else driving them? The clinical nature of that hidden ledger, the methodical way they had organized and disposed of the bodies, suggested a coldness that went beyond mere greed. Some who studied the case came to believe that the Hollises, or at least one member of the family, had killed not just for profit but because they enjoyed it, because they found satisfaction in the power they held over their unsuspecting guests. There were attempts to trace the Hollis family's background, to understand where they had come from, and whether they had committed similar crimes before arriving in Illinois. But records from that era were sparse and often unreliable, especially for people who might have been trying to hide their pasts. Investigators found several families named Hollis in various eastern states, but none that could be definitively connected to the Illinois murderers. The family seemed to have materialized on the frontier fully formed, with no clear history and no traceable connections to the world they had left behind. This mystery of origins only added to the legend. Some speculated that Thomas Hollis had been a criminal in the East, perhaps involved in robbery or smuggling, who had fled west to escape prosecution. Others suggested that Eleanor had been the driving force, that beneath her refined manner lurked someone with a taste for murder who had found the perfect partner in Thomas. A few theories even suggested that the entire family were sociopaths, a rare confluence of pathology that had found the perfect environment in which to thrive. The fate of young Caleb Hollis particularly fascinated those who studied the case. He would have been a child or young teenager when the family arrived in Illinois, which raised the disturbing question of whether he had been born into this life of crime or had been gradually corrupted by his parents. Some accounts suggested that Caleb had been hesitant and troubled, that his strange behavior and silence stemmed from an internal conflict between the evil he was surrounded by and some remaining moral sense. Others believed he had been an enthusiastic participant, perhaps even the most dangerous of the three, due to his youth and strength. One particularly disturbing theory, based on a few cryptic entries in the hidden ledger, suggested that Caleb had been assigned the task of disposing of bodies and managing the underground chamber. If true, this would mean that he had spent years of his young life handling corpses, digging graves and maintaining the physical infrastructure of his family's murder operation. What kind of psychological damage would such experiences inflict on a developing mind? And what kind of monster might emerge from such an upbringing? These questions took on renewed urgency in 1815, when a series of murders in Missouri Territory bore striking similarities to the Hollis crimes. Travelers along certain routes began disappearing under circumstances that seemed eerily familiar. Last seen accepting hospitality from a friendly farm family, vanishing without a trace, their belongings later turning up in suspicious circumstances. The family in question, the Johnsons, consisted of a middle-aged couple and their adult son, which matched the general structure of the Hollis household. Missouri authorities investigated, but the Johnsons proved to be legitimate settlers with documented histories and no apparent connection to the Illinois murders. The similarities seemed to be coincidental, or perhaps evidence of a copycat situation, someone who had heard of the Hollis crimes and decided to emulate them. Still, the incident raised uncomfortable questions about whether the Hollises might have inspired others, whether their crimes had planted seeds that would sprout in new and terrible forms across the expanding frontier. The investigation into the Johnson family ultimately cleared them of any wrongdoing, But the episode highlighted how deeply the Hollis case had penetrated public consciousness. Any mysterious disappearance along a frontier trade route, any family that seemed too isolated or too prosperous for their apparent means, risked being compared to the Hollises. The case had created a template, a pattern that people looked for even when it wasn't really there. In some ways, this hypervigilance was protective, making it more difficult for similar criminals to operate undetected. But it also fostered an atmosphere of suspicion that could be corrosive to the community trust that frontier survival depended on. As the decades passed and the frontier itself moved westward, the Hollis case gradually transitioned from recent history to legend. The generation that had lived through it began to die off, taking their first-hand memories with them. The victims' families eventually gave up hope of seeing justice served, though some maintained memorial sites and kept the memory of their lost loved ones alive, through stories passed down to children and grandchildren. The site of the Hollis farm itself continued to sit empty, a patch of prairie that no one wanted and everyone avoided. By the 1840s, most of the physical evidence of what had happened there had disappeared. The underground chamber had partially collapsed, and subsequent flooding had filled it with mud and debris. The foundations of the buildings were barely visible, covered by grass and small trees. If you didn't know what had happened there, you might pass by without giving it a second thought, seeing only an unremarkable patch of prairie land like thousands of others. But those who did know found it impossible to look at that land without feeling something, a chill, an unease, a sense that the ground itself remembered what had been done to it. Farmers whose land bordered the old Hollis property sometimes reported strange occurrences. Livestock would refuse to graze near the boundary, becoming agitated and distressed if forced to approach it. Dogs would bark at nothing visible, hackles raised and teeth bared at some threat that only they could perceive. And on certain nights, particularly in late summer when the air was still and heavy, people swore they could hear sounds carrying across the prairie, sounds that might have been wind or animals, or the settling of old timbers. But that seemed to those who heard them like voices, crying out from beneath the earth. These reports were sporadic and difficult to verify, the kind of ghost stories that every region accumulates over time. But they were persistent enough that by the 1850s, the old Hollis property had acquired a reputation as a haunted place, somewhere that sensible people avoided after dark. Local youth, of course, found this irresistible, and the ruins became a destination for those seeking to prove their courage by spending a night at the cursed site. Some returned with hair-raising tales of supernatural encounters. Others admitted they had seen and heard nothing unusual, but couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something malevolent was present, even if it chose not to manifest. In 1868, a historian named Marcus Whitfield became interested in the case as part of a larger project documenting crime and law enforcement on the early frontier. Whitfield was a methodical researcher, someone more interested in facts than folklore, and he approached the Hollis case with the intention of separating truth from myth. He traveled to Illinois, interviewed the few surviving witnesses who had been adults during the time of the crimes, and obtained access to what legal records still existed from that era. What Whitfield discovered both confirmed and complicated the existing narrative. The basic facts were undeniable. The Hollis family had murdered multiple people, hidden their bodies, and then disappeared before they could be brought to justice. But as Whitfield dug deeper, he began to uncover connections that previous investigators had missed. The ledger that had been recovered from the underground chamber, which Whitfield was able to examine, contained not just the names of victims in Illinois, but several entries that predated the family's known arrival in the territory. These earlier entries were cryptic, often containing only initials and dates rather than full names, but they suggested that the Hollis' criminal career had begun years before they established their farm along Devil's Stretch. Whitfield cross-referenced the initials and dates with missing persons reports from various eastern states and found several possible matches. If his identifications were correct, the Hollis family had been operating for more than a decade, possibly moving from place to place as suspicion mounted or opportunities diminished, leaving a trail of bodies across multiple states. This revelation, published in Whitfield's 1870 book, Dark Hearths, Crime and Punishment on the American Frontier, shocked even those who thought they knew the full story. It suggested that the 19 confirmed victims in Illinois were only a fraction of the family's total death toll. Whitfield estimated, based on his research and the fragmentary evidence in the ledger, that the Hollises might have killed 30 or more people over the course of their criminal career. If true, this would make them among the most prolific serial killers in American history up to that point, operating long before such crimes were understood or categorized in modern terms. Whitfield's book also raised new questions about the Hollis family's ultimate fate. He had uncovered reports from Missouri, Arkansas, and even Texas that mentioned families matching the Hollises' description in the years after 1799. None of these reports could be definitively verified, and the families in question always seemed to vanish before they could be thoroughly investigated. But the pattern was suggestive. Was it possible that the Hollises had simply continued their crimes in new locations, staying one step ahead of justice as they moved ever westward into less settled territories? The idea was disturbing but plausible. The American frontier in the early 19th century was vast and largely lawless, with limited communication between different regions and even more limited ability to track people who wanted to disappear. A family with money, cunning, and no moral constraints could conceivably operate for years or even decades before being caught, especially if they were smart enough to vary their patterns and move regularly. But Whitfield also presented an alternative theory based on reports he had gathered from various sources. Several people claimed to have encountered or heard about the Hollis family meeting violent ends in the wilderness, killed by Native Americans defending their territory, dead from disease, or even murdered by other criminals in a kind of frontier justice. These accounts were unverified and contradictory, but they offered a different kind of closure, the possibility that the Hollises had received the death they had meted out to so many others. The publication of Whitfield's book sparked renewed interest in the case and led to several additional investigations. Law enforcement officials in various states reviewed their old missing persons cases, looking for patterns that might connect to the Hollises. Journalists traveled to Illinois to visit the site of the original crimes and interview local residents about the legends that had grown up around it. And amateur detectives began their own research, trying to trace the family's movements before Illinois and after their disappearance. One particular lead emerged from this renewed attention. A woman in Louisiana claimed that her grandmother had worked as a servant for a family in New Orleans in the early 1800s that matched the description of the Hollises. According to family stories passed down through generations, this family had arrived suddenly with considerable wealth, but no clear explanation of its source. They had lived quietly in the city for several years before the father and mother died within weeks of each other from yellow fever during an epidemic in 1805. Their son, the woman claimed, had inherited their estate and then disappeared, last seen boarding a ship bound for Europe. Investigators traveled to New Orleans and managed to find some records that seemed to support this account. A family named Harris, close enough to Hollis that it could have been a deliberate, similar name chosen to reduce the risk of Arte, accidentally responding to the wrong surname, had indeed lived in the city during the relevant period. The ages and basic descriptions matched, though documentation from that era was sparse enough that certainty was impossible. If this was indeed the Hollis family, it meant that Thomas and Eleanor had died of disease rather than meeting any sort of justice, while Caleb had escaped with their accumulated wealth and vanished into the broader world. The European trail, if it existed, was impossible to follow. Records of ship passengers from that era were incomplete at best, and even if Caleb Hollis or Harris or whatever name he was using had reached Europe, he could have gone anywhere and become anyone. The wealthy could buy new identities, establish themselves in new places, and completely erase their pasts if they had enough money and determination. If the Louisiana theory was correct, Caleb Hollis might have lived out his life in comfortable anonymity somewhere in Europe, dying peacefully in bed decades after helping his parents murder dozens of innocent people. It was an unsatisfying conclusion, but one that fit the often unjust realities of the era. Not everyone accepted Whitfield's theories or the Louisiana connection. Skeptics pointed out that the evidence was circumstantial at best, that similar names and general descriptions didn't constitute proof. and that the temptation to connect every unsolved mystery to a famous case was strong. They argued that the Hollis family had most likely died somewhere in the wilderness, their bones scattered by animals and weather, their crimes dying with them. In the absence of definitive proof either way, the debate continued, with both sides marshalling evidence and arguments that could be interpreted multiple ways depending on one's starting assumptions. What wasn't debatable was the impact the case had on the collective memory of the region. By the late 19th century, the story of the Hollis farm had been codified into a specific narrative form, told and retold with variations, but always hitting the same key points: the isolated farm, the friendly family, the vanishing travelers, the underground chamber full of bodies, and the killers who escaped justice. The story functioned as a moral lesson about the dangers of the frontier, the importance of community vigilance, and the disturbing reality that evil could hide behind even the most innocent-seeming facade. Parents told the story to their children, emphasizing the importance of caution and the value of staying close to community networks rather than trusting strangers. Churches used it in sermons about the corrupting power of greed and the necessity of moral education. Law enforcement invoked it when arguing for better funding and more systematic approaches to justice. The Hollis farm became a kind of cultural shorthand, a reference point that everyone understood, and that carried layers of meaning beyond the bare facts of the crimes. The physical site itself took on an almost sacred quality, though it was a dark and fearful sanctity, rather than a holy one. By the 1870s, the land that had once been the Hollis farm was avoided, not just because of superstition but out of respect for the victims. Some families of those who had been murdered made pilgrimages to the site, leaving flowers or other tokens to mark the place where their loved ones had been found, even if the actual graves were elsewhere. These visits were private and solemn, acts of remembrance that acknowledged the importance of the location, even as they wished it didn't have to exist. There were also those who came to the site out of morbid curiosity, tourists of tragedy, who wanted to see where such terrible things had happened. Local residents generally viewed these visitors with distaste, seeing them as disrespectful ghoul-seekers who treated real suffering as entertainment. But there was little that could be done to prevent such visits. The land was, after all, simply empty prairie, with no structures remaining and no legal way to restrict access. In the 1880s, as the region around the old Hollis property continued to develop and more settlers arrived, there was renewed discussion about what should be done with the land. Some argued for establishing a formal memorial to the victims, perhaps a marker or monument that would acknowledge what had happened and ensure it was never forgotten. Others felt that memorializing the site would only draw more unwanted attention, and that the best approach was to let nature continue reclaiming it, allowing the grass to grow and the memories to fade. The debate became moot when a series of settlers who attempted to farm near the old Hollis property reported persistent problems. Crops failed in that specific area, even when they flourished elsewhere. Livestock that strayed onto the land became sick or behaved strangely. Wells dug near the site produced water that, while technically drinkable, had a foul taste that no amount of filtering could remove. Whether these problems had some natural explanation, perhaps contamination from the decomposed bodies, or geological features that affected soil quality and water, or were the result of psychological factors and confirmation bias, the practical effect was the same. No one could successfully farm that land, and after several failed attempts, people simply stopped trying. By 1900, the land where the Hollis farm had stood was essentially a dead zone, a patch of unusually sparse prairie that remained empty even as development spread around it. Local farmers whose property bordered it maintained the boundaries carefully, ensuring that the cursed ground didn't somehow contaminate their own land. Children were warned to stay away from it, though this of course meant that it became irresistible to the more adventurous or rebellious among them. The stories told about the site had evolved significantly by this point, incorporating elements of folklore and supernatural belief that would have been foreign to the original accounts. Now it wasn't just a place where murders had occurred, but a genuinely haunted location where the restless spirits of victims still wandered, seeking justice or at least acknowledgement. People claimed to see ghostly figures moving through the area at night, travelers eternally approaching a farmhouse that no longer existed, or the Hollis family themselves, condemned to repeat their crimes in some spectral realm. Some accounts spoke of a phantom light that appeared on certain nights, described variously as a lantern carried by a searching spirit, or as some form of supernatural energy released by the accumulated evil of the place. Others mentioned sounds, voices, screams, the creak of a wagon or the whinny of horses, that seemed to echo from the past. A few claimed to have experienced more aggressive phenomena, reporting being pushed or grabbed by invisible hands, or feeling sudden cold spots and overwhelming dread that forced them to flee. Skeptics dismissed these stories as products of overactive imaginations influenced by knowledge of the site's history. They pointed out that natural phenomena like swamp gas, unusual acoustics, or ordinary animals could explain most of the reported occurrences. Believers, however, insisted that there was something genuinely wrong with the place, that the evil that had been done there had left a permanent scar on the fabric of reality itself. The debate between skeptics and believers played out in newspaper articles, letters, and eventually early academic papers as the new field of folklore studies began to emerge. Scholars interested in ghost stories and legends saw the Hollis farm as a perfect case study, an example of how historical trauma could generate and sustain supernatural narratives across generations. They documented the various versions of the story, noting how details changed over time and how the tale adapted to reflect the concerns and beliefs of different eras. What these folklorists found was that the core story remained remarkably stable even as embellishments accumulated around it. The essential facts, the murders, the hidden chamber, the disappearance of the killers, stayed constant, suggesting that these elements were too well established and too well documented to be altered by the usual processes of oral tradition. The supernatural elements, by contrast, were fluid and varied, reflecting individual creativity and cultural context rather than any consistent underlying reality. As the 20th century arrived, bringing with it new technologies and new ways of understanding the world, the story of the Hollis farm began to fade from prominence. The frontier era was ending, replaced by a more settled and urbanized society. The cases that captured public attention were increasingly contemporary crimes, investigated with modern forensic techniques and documented with photography and systematic record-keeping. The Hollis murders, fascinating as they were, belonged to a past that seemed increasingly distant and disconnected from modern life. But the story never entirely disappeared. It remained part of local culture, taught in schools as regional history, referenced in community discussions about crime and justice, and told around campfires as a classic ghost story. Every generation of children growing up in the area learned about the Hollis farm, usually hearing some version of the tale that emphasized either the historical facts or the supernatural legends depending on who was doing the telling. In the 1930s, during the Great Depression, there was briefly renewed interest in the site when a proposed highway project threatened to route traffic directly through where the Hollis farm had stood. Local residents objected strenuously, not on practical grounds, but out of a feeling that the land was cursed and that disturbing it further would bring bad luck or worse. The objections were strong enough that the Highway Commission adjusted their plans, routing the road slightly to the north and leaving the old Hollis property undisturbed. Whether this decision was made out of respect for local sentiment or because engineers found legitimate geological reasons to prefer the alternate route was never entirely clear. But the result was that the haunted prairie remained isolated and untouched. World War II brought new priorities and new concerns, and for a time the old frontier murders seemed like ancient history, barely relevant to a world facing existential threats. But in the post-war era, as America experienced economic growth and suburbanization, there was renewed interest in local history and folklore. The Hollis farm story was revived in books and articles aimed at a popular audience, often sensationalized, but still rooted in the historical facts. It was during this period that the story began to be connected to broader patterns of American serial murder. Researchers looking at criminal history started recognizing that the Hollis case represented an early example of what would later be understood as serial killing, motivated by both profit and psychological gratification. The methodical nature of the crimes, the way the family had systematically targeted vulnerable individuals, and the evidence suggesting they derived satisfaction from their murders beyond the mere financial gain. All of these elements fit patterns that would become tragically familiar in later decades. This reframing of the Hollis case from frontier horror story to early serial murder case brought new analytical approaches to understanding what had happened. Criminologists and psychologists tried to develop profiles of the family members based on the available evidence, attempting to understand what would drive people to such sustained violence. These efforts were limited by the sparse documentation and the vast temporal distance from the crimes, but they produced theories about family dysfunction, sociopathy, and the ways that isolated environments could allow pathological behavior to flourish unchecked. In the 1970s, our team of archaeologists and forensic anthropologists received permission to conduct a scientific excavation of the old Hollis property. Using modern techniques and equipment, they hoped to recover any remaining evidence that might shed light on the crimes or the victims. What they found was both illuminating and disturbing. The underground chamber, though partially collapsed and filled with sediment, still existed. Careful excavation revealed structural details that provided insight into how it had been constructed and used. The chamber was actually larger than the 1799 investigators had realized, with multiple sections that had been used for different purposes. There were storage areas for stolen goods, a section that appeared to have been living quarters of sorts, and the burial pits where bodies had been disposed of. Most significantly, the archaeologists uncovered additional human remains that hadn't been found during the original investigation. These remains were fragmentary and scattered, mixed with soil and debris, but careful analysis identified bone fragments from at least 3 individuals who hadn't been accounted for in the known victim count. This discovery confirmed what many had suspected, that the Hollis family's crimes had been even more extensive than originally believed. The remains were removed for analysis, and forensic anthropologists attempted to extract whatever information they could from bones that had been buried for nearly 2 centuries. They were able to determine approximate ages at death and identify several instances of trauma that had likely been fatal. Skulls with fractures, bones showing cut marks, ribs with damage consistent with stabbing. The physical evidence painted a picture of violence that was often sudden and brutal, suggesting that victims had been attacked when they were vulnerable, probably while sleeping or otherwise off guard. One particularly haunting discovery was a collection of personal items that had somehow been missed during the original investigation. These included pieces of jewelry, buttons from clothing, and most poignantly a small wooden toy horse carefully carved and worn smooth by handling. This toy suggested that at least one of the victims had been a child, traveling with a family who had all likely been murdered together. The image of a child's toy lying buried in that dark chamber for over a century seemed to crystallize the full horror of what had happened at the Hollis farm. The archaeological findings received significant media attention, bringing the story to a new generation of Americans who had never heard of the case. True crime was becoming increasingly popular as a cultural phenomenon, and the Hollis murders had all the elements that such audiences craved: mystery, horror, and the tantalizing possibility that the killers had never been caught. Books and articles about the case proliferated, each offering its own theories about who the Hollises really were and what had ultimately happened to them. Some writers attempted to humanize the Hollis family, exploring possible psychological explanations for their behavior and looking for evidence of abuse or trauma in their backgrounds that might have contributed to their descent into murder. Others took a harder line, portraying them as essentially evil figures who had chosen their path consciously and operated with cold calculation. The debates about how to understand the Hollises reflected broader cultural arguments about criminal responsibility, the nature of evil, and the extent to which individuals could be shaped by circumstances versus exercising free will. In the 1980s and 1990s, as true crime television became more prominent, the Hollis case was featured in several documentary programs. These shows combined historical reenactments with expert analysis, walking viewers through the crimes and their investigation. They filmed on location in Illinois, showing the empty prairie where the farmhouse once stood and interviewing local residents about the legends that still surrounded the place. The shows varied in quality and accuracy, with some treating the story respectfully while others sensationalized it, But all of them helped ensure that the Hollis murders remained part of public consciousness. The site itself, meanwhile, continued to resist any form of development or use. The land remained empty, though now it was surrounded by modern farms, roads, and occasional suburban housing developments. It stood out as an anomaly, a patch of untouched prairie in an otherwise developed landscape. Efforts to purchase and develop the land invariably fell through for one reason or another. Potential buyers backed out, financing failed to materialize, or local opposition proved insurmountable. There were those who argued that the continued isolation of the site was simply the result of bad luck and local superstition, that there was nothing inherently wrong with the land itself. But others maintained that the ground was genuinely cursed, that the evil done there had poisoned it in some fundamental way that went beyond mere psychology or folklore. They pointed to the continued reports of strange occurrences in the area, the persistent failure of any attempt to use the land productively, and the way that even animals seemed to avoid it, as evidence that something was genuinely wrong. By the early 21st century, the Hollis Farm story had achieved a kind of immortality in regional culture. It was simultaneously historical fact and supernatural legend, true crime case and ghost story, cautionary tale and entertainment. Different groups claimed it for different purposes. Historians as an example of frontier justice and its limitations, criminologists as an early serial murder case, folklorists as a demonstration of how trauma generates lasting narratives, and paranormal enthusiasts as evidence of genuine haunting. The advent of the internet brought new life to the story, as websites and forums dedicated to true crime and the paranormal shared information about the case and debated its details. Amateur researchers combed through online archives, looking for additional evidence that might solve the lingering mysteries about the Hollis family's origins and fate. Some claim to have found connections to other unsolved crimes from the early 1800s, suggesting that the Hollis' murder spree had been even more extensive than previously believed. Others focused on the supernatural aspects, sharing accounts of recent visits to the site and experiences they claimed to have had there. In 2015, a team of paranormal investigators filmed an episode at the old Hollis property, using electromagnetic field detectors, infrared cameras, and other equipment to search for evidence of ghostly activity. The footage they captured was ambiguous at best, odd sounds and temperature fluctuations that could have been either supernatural or entirely mundane, depending on one's interpretation. But the episode attracted significant viewership, introducing yet another generation to the story and ensuring its continued presence in popular culture. More serious research continued as well. In 2018, a historian at the University of Illinois published a comprehensive study of the case. Utilizing newly digitized archives and advanced genealogical techniques to trace the Hollis family's movements before they arrived in Illinois. The research confirmed that the family had indeed operated in Pennsylvania and Virginia before moving west, and identified at least 3 missing persons cases from those states that likely represented additional Hollis victims. The study estimated that the family's total victim count could be as high as 35 people, making them one of the most prolific serial killer family units in American history. This research also uncovered a disturbing detail that had been missed by previous investigators. There was evidence suggesting that the Hollis family had briefly operated a similar establishment years before in Pennsylvania, offering hospitality to travelers along a different trade route. That operation had apparently ended when local suspicion grew, forcing the family to relocate. This suggested a pattern of behavior. The family would establish themselves in a location, prey on travelers until scrutiny became too intense, then move on to start again somewhere else. Illinois had simply been one stop in a longer criminal career, and the family's disappearance in 1799 may have been just another planned relocation rather than a desperate flight. If this interpretation was correct, it raised the troubling possibility that the Hollis family had simply moved on to new hunting grounds after leaving Illinois, perhaps in Missouri or Arkansas or even Texas, where they could have continued their crimes for years before age or circumstance finally ended their run. The thought that they might have died peacefully in old age, never facing justice for their crimes, was profoundly unsettling but entirely possible given the realities of frontier law enforcement. Modern forensic analysis of the remains recovered from the site has provided additional insights into the victims and how they died. DNA analysis, while limited by the degraded state of the bones, has allowed some victims to be matched to missing persons cases through comparison with DNA, extracted from hair samples preserved in old lockets or from living descendants of families who had missing members. This has allowed several victims to finally be identified by name and given proper recognition. Their stories rescued from historical obscurity. The physical evidence has also confirmed the brutal nature of the murders. Many victims showed signs of blunt force trauma to the head, suggesting they had been struck from behind without warning. Others showed evidence of stabbing or cutting, and a few appeared to have been strangled. The variety of methods suggested that the killers had been opportunistic, using whatever means was convenient and effective, rather than following a particular pattern. This randomness may have been part of what made them difficult to catch. Without a consistent modus operandi, it was harder to definitively link different crimes to the same perpetrators. Today, more than 2 centuries after the Hollis family's crimes were discovered, the land where their farmhouse stood remains empty. A historical marker was finally erected in 2010, providing a brief summary of what happened there and acknowledging the victims who died. The marker is simple and understated, avoiding sensationalism while ensuring that those who pass by know they are at a site of historical significance. The marker reads, "Near this spot stood a farmhouse operated by the Hollis family from approximately 1795 to 1799. Investigation in 1799 revealed that the family had murdered numerous travelers who had accepted their hospitality. At least 19 victims were found buried on the property, though the total number may have been higher. The Hollis family disappeared before they could be arrested and were never brought to justice. This marker commemorates the victims of these crimes and serves as a reminder of a dark chapter in our region's history. Visitors still come to the site, some drawn by historical interest, others by the supernatural legends, still others by the morbid fascination that crime scenes have always attracted. They stand on the prairie grass looking at the empty land and try to imagine what stood there 200 years ago. They think about travelers approaching that farmhouse, relieved to find shelter, grateful for the kindness of strangers. They think about that moment when relief turned to terror, when hospitality revealed itself as a trap. They think about the families who never learned what happened to their loved ones, who waited for letters and visits that would never come. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind moves through the grass in just the right way, visitors report feeling something they can't quite articulate, a sense of sorrow perhaps, or of presence. They describe feeling watched, feeling as though the land itself is aware of them and is trying to communicate something. Whether this is genuine paranormal phenomena, the product of suggestion and expectation, or simply the human mind's tendency to find meaning and pattern in randomness, it doesn't really matter. The effect is the same, a reminder that what happened here was real, that people died here, and that some wounds leave scars that never fully heal. The story of the Hollis farm endures because it touches something fundamental about human nature and human society. It's a story about trust and its betrayal, about how the civilized mask can hide monstrosity, about the fragility of safety in a dangerous world. It reminds us that evil is not always obvious, that it can smile and offer you a place at its table before destroying you. And it confronts us with the uncomfortable reality that justice is not guaranteed, that sometimes the guilty escape and are never called to account for their crimes. But the story is also about memory and the importance of bearing witness. The victims of the Hollis family were not forgotten. Their names, as many as could be recovered, have been recorded. Their stories, as much as can be known, have been told. The horror of what happened to them has been acknowledged and remembered, passed down through generations, ensuring that they are not simply anonymous victims, but individuals who mattered, whose lives had value and whose deaths deserved recognition. In the end, the farm where guests checked in but never left stands as a testament to both the darkness that humans are capable of and the light of human memory that refuses to let that darkness have the final word. The Hollis family may have escaped earthly justice, but they could not escape history. Their crimes have been documented, studied, and condemned. Their victims have been honored and remembered, and the place where those crimes occurred, though it remains empty and unused, serves as a memorial to the lives that were stolen there. The prairie grass grows tall each summer, bending and waving in the wind, covering the ground where terrible secrets once lay buried. Birds nest in the small trees that have grown up over the years. Insects buzz and small animals burrow in the earth. Life continues, as it always does, indifferent to human tragedy. But the land remembers in its way, and as long as people tell the story, as long as the history is preserved and the victims are named, the Hollis Farm will remain what it has become, a place of remembrance, a warning, and a reminder that evil may hide but cannot ultimately escape the judgment of history and memory. The ground that once held so much death now holds stories instead, and stories, it turns out, are harder to bury than bodies. They survive when everything else has crumbled to dust. They cross generations, adapting and evolving but retaining their essential truth. And they ensure that those who were silenced by violence still have a voice, still have a presence in the world, still matter to those who come after. That perhaps is the only justice the victims of Harper's Rest will ever receive. But it is not nothing. In a world where so many crimes go unpunished and so many victims are forgotten, to be remembered is itself a kind of victory. The Hollis family may have stolen lives, may have stolen futures and dreams and all the years their victims should have had. But they could not steal memory, could not prevent the truth from eventually emerging, could not silence the voices that would tell this story across centuries, and so the tale endures, as dark and troubling today as it was when those underground chambers were first opened and their terrible contents revealed. The farm where guests checked in but never left has become something more than a historical footnote, more than a ghost story, more than a cautionary tale. It has become a part of the American memory, a reminder of the price of the frontier, the cost of isolation, and the evil that can flourish when communities fail to watch over one another. It stands as evidence that the past is never truly past, that history lives on in the landscape and in the stories we tell, and that some places, some events, leave marks that time cannot erase. The sun sets over the Illinois prairie, casting long shadows across empty land where once a farmhouse stood. The wind whispers through the grass, carrying with it perhaps the echoes of voices long silenced. And in the gathering darkness the place waits for the next visitor, the next storyteller, the next generation to discover its secrets and ensure that what happened here is never forgotten. Because that is what we owe the dead, to remember, to bear witness, and to tell their stories so that they live on, long after their bones have turned to dust and their names have faded from all records but memory. The mystery of what ultimately happened to the Hollis family may never be solved. They may have died in the wilderness, lived out their lives in anonymity, or continued their crimes elsewhere under different names. But in the final analysis, their fate matters less than the memory of their victims and the lessons their crimes can teach us. The farm where guests checked in but never left is more than a place. It's a story, a warning, and a promise that evil, no matter how carefully hidden, will eventually be brought into the light. And there, in the light of history and remembrance, the victims of Harper's Rest finally receive the recognition they were denied in life. Their stories preserved and honored by all who learn of them, their suffering acknowledged, and their names, as many as could be recovered, spoken aloud so that they are never truly forgotten. That is the true haunting of the Hollis farm, not ghosts or curses, but the weight of memory and the unbreakable bond between past and present, between the dead and those who remember them.